Good afternoon, everyone.
Yep. Slam dunk. Let's do it.
Thank you for everyone for joining us today on this third panel of Project Adam. I'm Alan Agnes. I'm a military fellow here at CSIS. And for this panel, we'll be discussing obstacles of building a more flexible nuclear force. CSIS and PONI recognizes that we explore the path of a more flexible deterrent force. There are significant challenges and obstacles to overcome. These hurdles, stemming from both technical and policy-related issues, play a crucial role in shaping the future of nuclear deterrence strategies. PONI is dedicated to addressing and analyzing these challenges to provide valuable insights for navigating a complex landscape for the nuclear force modernization. I'm very honored today to have Ms. Madeline Creedon, Mr. Justin Anderson, and Ms. Rebecca Heinrichs next to me. As a military fellow, I'm dealing with a lot of colonels and generals, but nobody of this stature, so I'm very privileged and honored, so thank you. I'll get a very short intro to each person here so we get more into the discussion and questions here. So Ms. Madeline Creedon is currently a president of Green Marble Group, LLC. Before her current position, she was the principal deputy administrator, National Nuclear Security Administration, United States Department of Energy. And previously that was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, United States Department of Defense. Ms. Creedon is also the chairman for the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States. Mr. Justin Anderson is a senior policy fellow at National Defense University Center for Study of Nuclear Weapons and Mass Destruction. Prior to joining the center, he was a senior policy analyst at Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, providing research analysis on arms control, non-proliferation, counter-weapon mass destruction, and deterrence issues to the United States Air Force, U.S. STRATCOM, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and the OSD Office of Treaty Compliance. And finally, Ms. Rebecca Heinrichs is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and a director of its Keystone Defense Initiative. Ms. Heinrichs currently serves as a commissioner on the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission, which was created in the fiscal year of 2022, National Defense Authorization Act, and the Posture Commission report was just published this past month. She also serves on the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group and National Independent Panel on Military Service and Readiness. So thank you again for everyone being here and taking time out of your day. Before we get started our discussion, I'll go over some rules of engagement. I think most of you have been here for the first two panels, but I'll just reemphasize that. We got the lunch settling in the stomach. I'll leave time at the end for questions. There's a QR code in front of you. Just scan that, please, and the questions will filter up to me. Each of our panel members has a different perspective of the topic. So that's all part of the integrated approach that we have here to get different perspectives. Each panel member will get about 10 minutes for the opening remarks. And without further ado, we'll start off with Ms. Creedon.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And of course, it's a pleasure being here today. Heather, thanks for inviting me. And as you might expect, I'll focus today on the Strategic Posture Commission report. It's extremely relevant to your discussion and also to the project. I'd also note that, of course, and you heard you heard from several of them this morning. Two of the commissioners, Frank Miller and Leonor Tamaro, were authors on the Project Adam report, and then Greg Weaver, who was also on the panel this morning, was our senior advisor. And it is my mission these days to get the word out on the Strategic Posture Commission report. But it is also important, I think, that the timing of both your report and the Strategic Posture Commission report, because it's important, more so than ever, that we engage in discussion and understanding of the new geopolitical changes. So kudos to PONI for studying and for convening all of this today. The Strategic Posture Commission report is consistent, it's always good to know, with one statutory charge. So it was a very broad remit. We were asked to conduct a review of the strategic posture, not nuclear, but the strategic posture, so both, of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure, and factors affecting the strategic stability of new peer competitors of the U.S. and peer and near-peer nuclear power competition. So it was very clear that we had a very broad task in front of us. The report is threat-informed, forward-looking, bipartisan, and it's a consensus. which in and of itself says volumes for today. Not only was it a consensus report, and I can assure you we hassled and haggled and debated over darn near every word in the report, but and you know, a couple commissioners here can attest.
Not the two of you, though. You guys were fine.
But I mean, it was a commitment by all of the commissioners. And Leonore as well. It was a commitment by all of the commissioners to really achieving consensus. And there were several things that got us there, not the least of which was the threat. And that's really why having these discussions today is hugely important. So the time frame for our report is 2027 and beyond, looking at least to 2035. That's also important. So our recommendations are forward-looking. Although the report is hard-hitting, it's also fairly subtle. And this subtlety, I think, has led to some confusion about what the report does and does not recommend, including that we are not, and I just want to underscore not, recommending substantial increases in the U.S. nuclear force posture, and we are not recommending that the U.S. engage in a new nuclear arms race. We do put a lot of emphasis on having more conventional capability and having more flexibility in the nuclear force structure and in the conventional force structure as well. And of course, as I mentioned, it's threat-based. So we all know threats from China and Russia are growing very differently, but very rapidly. I'll skip some of this. And one of the things that was most interesting as we both looked at the previous commission, which had been chartered in 2008, and their report was issued in 2009, is that very hopeful environment and the vision of widespread nuclear reductions from a decade ago. It's just no longer realistic, and the prospects for agreement on nuclear arms control today are bleak. The first Strategic Posture Commission, which, as I mentioned, had been established in 2008, had a charge very similar to ours: conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States and make a recommendation on how to move forward. But the policy considerations on which the first commissioners were most focused were very different than today. In their 2009 report, the policy balance was between the need to maintain an effective nuclear deterrent on the one hand, and on the other, still lead international efforts to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation and reduce the saliency and number of nuclear weapons globally. And that commission also hoped the world would head in a direction in which proliferation and nuclear terrorism are reduced, and where there is cooperation among major powers to ensure strategic stability. In the chairman's preface, he said, and this is former Secretary Perry, they rejected the vision of a world defined over the next decade or two by a renewal of competition for nuclear advantage among the major powers. Well, that vision, unfortunately, didn't come to fruition. And so today, the U.S. is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting for which we did not plan, and we are not well prepared. So our commission was very focused on being prepared, laying the foundations now for decisions in the future. We want to ensure that decision makers can actually make decisions, that they have options, and that they have options that they can actually implement in the future. So facing and confronting two nuclear peers is, of course, unprecedented, and the ultimate question is, well, now what? So how does the U.S. maintain its leadership role in the world, preserve the rules-based international order, stay aligned with allies, and thus preserving a considerable strategic advantage, and fundamentally deter conflict? Most importantly, credibly deter nuclear conflict. And the challenge, as laid out in the SPC report, is to build a strategic posture that has the highest probability to secure and further U.S. vital interests into the future, as well as prevent a major power war or nuclear employment at all. As a nation, we must act now, and with a sense of urgency that the Commission did not always see. And so steps must be taken now, we found, to enable near and longer-term decisions. It's essential that what the U.S. does now, and in the next few years, enables the flexibility that will be needed to shape the conventional and nuclear force structure and not foreclose options that might be needed in the future. That said, there's no reason to stop pursuing broader risk reduction efforts when achievable and in the U.S. national interest. If there are opportunities for arms control or other strategic stability talks, military-to-military talks, confidence-building measures, or other opportunities, they should all be explored. I should add that this is also one of the things that isn't discussed much. The Commission has an entire chapter on risk reduction, so it was very much front and center in our thinking and our discussions. We have several assumptions that underpin our report. One is that Russia and China will continue their current respective adversarial paths, each growing the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. China will continue to grow its conventional forces, including its cyber and space capabilities, and Russia will also grow its cyber and space capabilities, and each will continue their aggressive foreign policies and seek to supplant the U.S. global leadership role. Today's one major war strategy construct is no longer viable, particularly given China's current trajectory. The 6 foundational, long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear strategy remain valid, and these objectives should continue to shape nuclear defense strategy and planning. And also hedging against the risk. Hedging ensures that the U.S. can address geopolitical, technical, operation, and programmatic risks that could render U.S. nuclear forces insufficient to effectively carry out U.S. strategy. Strong allies and partners are essential and make all of us stronger. But we need greater cooperation, more coordination, more integration across the board with our allies. The U.S. deterrent must be credible and must be seen that way, not only by our adversaries, but also by our allies and partners. And in addition, the U.S. needs a true whole-of-government approach to deter and prepare for the possibility of a two-theater conflict. I know everybody says this, but this is hugely important, and we as a nation have to learn to do this better, because frankly, both China and Russia do it better already, and we're catching up. The U.S. defense and nuclear strategy must be implemented to effectively deter and defeat simultaneous aggression in two theaters. China can no longer be considered a lesser included case for force structure planning, and nuclear and conventional force sizing and composition must reflect this strategy. If Russia and China stay on their current trajectories, and nothing we have seen would indicate a change, although of course we all hope the situation could improve, the composition of our overall forces must change. With respect to the program of record, we found that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to address the projected threat. And the report outlines many ways in which the POR might be supplemented. And those are on 47 to 49, should you be interested in actually looking. The program of record includes replacement of every delivery system, the warheads, and a comprehensive modernization of U.S. nuclear command and control. One of the most challenging period of time is actually going to be the transition period as the older systems are retired and the new systems come out. So as a result, the U.S. really has to do things that are not normal. In other words, we have to focus and sustain the older systems until the new systems come on board. We must ensure that those legacy systems are sustained and funded so that the nuclear deterrent is safe, secure, reliable, and effective during this transition period. And unpleasant as it may be, we already know that the new systems are late and they're going to be over budget. Unfortunately, there is a growing risk of confrontation with China, Russia, or both that includes the risk of military conflict, including the possibility of nuclear use. So to deter and prevent nuclear conflict, the U.S. must increase its conventional forces quantitatively and qualitatively, adopt a more resilient space architecture, modernize nuclear command and control, and advance integrated air and missile defense capabilities. Without more conventional forces to deter regional wars, the use of nuclear weapons regionally becomes more likely. Without significant conventional increases, the U.S. will need to rely more on nuclear weapons, increasing the role of nuclear weapons, not decreasing their role. And this is also, of course, something that the Nuclear Posture Review discussed in depth. I want to close by just mentioning the infrastructure and the industrial base that support all of DOE and the Department of Defense. In many cases, particularly at the National Nuclear Security Administration, the production infrastructure is very old. A new building in NNSA world probably dates to the 70s. In some instances, some of these facilities are actually falling down. The supply chain needs to be beefed up, and this is also true at DoD. DoD also has substantial infrastructure limitations. They have workforce limitations and a supply chain that's not highly reliable. So there's a huge investment that has to occur at both DOE and DoD in the infrastructure. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention continuing all of the excellent work on the NNSA science infrastructure and the stockpiled stewardship program. It has allowed us to maintain the stockpile, and it's also been the foundation for allowing the continuation of the stockpile, including some of the newer systems that are now in the books, like the W93. With that, I'll stop. I think I've probably gone over my 10 minutes anyway.
No, you're fine, Ms. Green. You hit on some really key points. I do appreciate you explaining some of that and clarifying.
Thank you.
Especially at the tactical and operational level. So,
Thanks.
thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Well, great. Well, thank you to Heather and to CSIS for the opportunity to speak today. The NDU INSS Center for the Study of WMD had the good fortune to work with a range of DoD colleagues on deterrence and assurance issues. And this experience informs my remarks. The views expressed today are my own, not those of the Department of Defense, National Defense University, or the U.S. government. So in answering the question of what are some of the obstacles to creating a more flexible nuclear arsenal for the purposes of deterring nuclear and other forms of strategic attack against the United States and its allies, I divide my presentation into two parts. First, I'll highlight a couple of challenges with regard to hardware, that is, delivery systems, weapons, enablers, and other physical objects that make up the U.S. nuclear deterrent. But the shiniest and best engineered kit is useless if you don't understand how to leverage it. And so flexibility must be understood not just in terms of the physical capacity of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. Equally as important is the human capital and leadership decision making behind U.S. nuclear deterrent strategy. And this will be the focus of the second half of my presentation. So with that preface, let me begin with hardware. There are three potential hardware obstacles I'd like to highlight, obstacles to creating a more flexible nuclear deterrent. So the first is cost. Nuclear modernization is an expensive process. Large defense programs often run over time and over budget. U.S. nuclear modernization will lead to the deployment of an upgraded and updated strategic nuclear deterrent. And this is absolutely essential given some of the threats and challenges already highlighted here today. Because the new U.S. systems will be better than their predecessors, I do think there is an important degree of additional flexibility that will be provided when the Columbia SSBN, Sentinel ICBM, and B-21 Raider come online. But I think the flexibility in the context of the question that was asked of the panelists is asking something about doing something more or different with the U.S. nuclear deterrent rather than modernization's role in maintaining an important status quo ante with regard to nuclear deterrence. So the first obstacle I want to highlight isn't the price tag of modernization, although that's significant, but the potential additional asks for dollars for additional nuclear-capable delivery systems or weapons. But I think members of Congress will ask, is that the best use of our limited defense and deterrence dollars? Let's consider, for example, the significant and deeply concerning growth in recent years of potential adversaries' dual-capable intermediate-range ground-launched delivery systems. These systems cast a nuclear shadow over today and tomorrow's regional security crises. And if a nuclear strike is delivered within a future conflict, because an adversary fears conventional defeat, it's very possible this is the type of system that would be employed. Now, I'm deeply concerned about these systems. I want to ensure the United States and its allies can deter and defeat them if necessary. But we have to answer the question of, is adding something new or different to U.S. nuclear deterrence forces the right approach? It might be. But the answer might also be more THAAD missile defense batteries or Aegis cruisers. It might be advanced conventional systems that can hold intermediate-range mobile missiles at risk. Or it might be dollars spent to make U.S. forces and their enablers better defended and more resilient against a nuclear attack. So if the U.S. requires a more flexible approach to nuclear deterrence, and that flexibility comes with additional costs, do I place those dollars on deterrence by nuclear weapons rather than conventional cost imposition? Do I place them on deterrence by denial means? Or do I place them on the third approach that's included within the DoD's joint operating concept on deterrence? That is, deterrence by encouraging restraint. So let me be clear, the modernization and program of record must be defended. The U.S. strategic nuclear deterrent is the floor, and nuclear deterrence and nuclear assurance will be seriously downgraded if cracks appear in that foundation, given potential adversaries' commitment today and tomorrow to their own nuclear arsenals. But to advocate for the strongest and most flexible approach to deterring adversary nuclear coercion and aggression, I think all researchers and analysts must very closely examine the merits of any system, whether nuclear dual capable or non-nuclear, and its contribution to our deterrence posture before recommending putting chips down on a specific square. The second obstacle to hardware flexibility I'd like to highlight is time. The goal of U.S. nuclear modernization is to produce a nuclear deterrent that will last for a generation or more. I'm very confident that when U.S. systems, they'll be top-notch when they roll off the assembly line. But given how long these systems are expected to last, and if you look at our past history, how much the U.S. has life extended everything in the nuclear deterrent force, let me put myself in the shoes of a policymaker or military planner 30 or even 40 years from now. Technology will advance. The adversary will get a vote. The risks and challenges to delivery systems, operators, and enablers will change. And this may change when, where, and how a future commander chooses to utilize a high-value platform, placing limitations on its visibility or its reach. Now, of course, the U.S. will continue to adapt systems. The B-52 today has a profile that the airman and maintainer of 1961 would recognize, but a lot is very different about the aircraft's operating systems. But my overall point with regard to time is that the flexibility of the force will face challenges and risks, to include ones we cannot anticipate, over their expected lifetime. And it will then face these risks and challenges again if the 138th or 143rd Congresses decide to try and life extend a venerable system just a little bit further. The third potential obstacle to flexibility I'd like to highlight with regard to hardware is enabling systems, which are often get overlooked. Tankers and airfields are a good example. U.S. strategic nuclear bombers have impressive reach, but to deter and assure in distant theaters, they require a tanker bridge. And tankers are a commodity much in demand within any regional crisis or conflict. In addition, airfields on Allied soil provide additional options for how we utilize bombers and the deterrence and assurance signals we can send with these airframes. The recent U.S. and Australian agreement to work to upgrade Australia's Tyndall Air Base is a good example of a bilateral agreement that grants our bomber force additional flexibility. Conversely, if airfields or airspace abroad is not available in a crisis or conflict, future crisis or conflict, because we were unable to secure agreement with an ally or partner, then we will have a less flexible bomber leg of the deterrent. Now let me shift to the second part of my presentation and discuss some human capital and human decision-making factors. So first, it's important to note that as a matter of law and policy, the United States, I believe correctly, puts significant guardrails on the flexibility of potential nuclear employment. The U.S., together with other members of the P5, reaffirmed in January 2022 the principle that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. The 2022 Nuclear Posture Review repeated language used by previous administrations that the U.S. will only consider the potential employment of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. Now, these are important U.S. policy limitations on potential nuclear employment, articulated and reaffirmed by several presidencies. I'd strongly counsel against changing them. Both in this present era, I would also counsel for the United States to carefully consider how to better integrate our nuclear deterrence forces within our defense and deterrence signaling and messaging, to include in regions that are increasingly under a nuclear shadow. Now, this is not advocacy for some form of nuclear saber-rattling American style. This is advocacy for recognizing the nuclear forces, how they are postured, and how nuclear strategies and postures are communicated, or conversely, how they're misrepresented, can shape operating environments for military commanders, can shape decision-making by leaders of nuclear and non-nuclear states, and can loom large within the information environment, leading to the informing or misinforming national publics in ways that can significantly impact defense and deterrence strategies. So a potential obstacle to the flexibility of our nuclear deterrent is a mindset that views the U.S. nuclear deterrent as something that must be recessed, tucked away, only to be thought about, communicated, or discussed during the lead up to some type of strategic crisis. The challenge is that while caution's understandable, for too long the United States and its allies ceded the information space to adversaries who drew the conclusion, continue to draw the conclusion, that rattling the nuclear saber could allow them to project power and influence to include over various facets of decision-making in U.S. and allied capitals. Now, I do think the United States has made some progress in pushing back against this challenge. Moves like sending the USS Kentucky SSBN to South Korea this past July and arranging a visit and press conference at the submarine for South Korean President Yoon, for example, as well as U.S. and allied social messaging showing U.S. B-52s flying alongside allied fighter aircraft from various states. These demonstrate that the United States can talk and tweet about our nuclear deterrent in ways that send clear and strong, but also in no way escalatory, signals to deter adversaries and assure allies. But I think the U.S. still remains behind the curve in developing U.S. and joint U.S.-allied messaging on how the U.S. nuclear deterrent is safe, secure, effective, and stabilizing, and do it in a way to counter efforts by our potential adversaries to highlight their own nuclear forces and issue covert and overt nuclear threats in ways that are calculated to exploit the 21st century information and media environment. The second and last point I'd like to make with regard to human capital and human decision-making is a separate but related one. The U.S. approach to nuclear weapons, that these are the president's weapons, and that POTUS, as I noted earlier, will only consider their potential employment in extreme circumstances. Again, I think this is a good approach. It's one I endorse. There is a risk, however, in viewing this language as so restricting the U.S. nuclear deterrent that plays little to no role within, for example, planning for regional crisis or contingencies. The present operating environment is one where several potential adversaries all have a number of options with regard to dual-capable theater-range delivery systems. Any future regional crisis or contingency involving these states will feature a nuclear shadow, as we've seen throughout Russia's unjust war against Ukraine. Now, the United States has multiple conventional options within any future conflict, as well as other levers of national power to impose costs or deny benefits. And the United States is working closely with allies to bolster combined deterrence postures across the globe. In doing so, however, I think it's important the U.S. should not recess or absent its nuclear deterrent. I agree with the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review's language that states, quote, "A pragmatic approach to integrated deterrence will seek to determine how the joint force can combine nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities in complementary ways that leverage the unique attributes of a multi-domain set of forces to enable a range of deterrence options backstopped by a credible nuclear deterrent," unquote. This does not mean lowering the threshold for nuclear use. This means creative thinking about how U.S. nuclear and U.S. and allied conventional forces can put forward a deterrence posture that reduces the capacity for adversaries to use their own nuclear forces for coercion and aggression. This is a challenge. The U.S. will need to think about how to better integrate its nuclear deterrent within regional defense postures without mirror imaging adversaries who lean on their nuclear forces for the purposes of intimidation. And just to give one example, I think this means for decision makers and planners for the U.S., we should consider that U.S. STRATCOM is not simply the break glass in the event of nuclear emergency option. Instead, it suggests that U.S. STRATCOM, through visits, rotations, exercises, and various forms of peacetime and pre-crisis signaling with our nuclear deterrent forces, and with those moves coordinated with regional combatant commands and with allies for the purposes of conventional force signaling, can all put together a flexible deterrence posture that will keep adversary nuclear forces on the sidelines of future regional crises and conflicts. If, however, the U.S. consigns this nuclear deterrent, whether in plans or policies, to a role that has little or no visibility in regional crises or conflicts, then the U.S. inadvertently risks both enabling adversary planning and also weakening its own nuclear deterrent by reducing its profile. So cautious policies, while understandable, we must be careful. They could sometimes lead unintentionally to inflexible planning. In summary, there are both hardware and human decision-making and other human factors that could be obstacles to developing, posturing, and communicating a flexible, nimble nuclear deterrent force, obstacles for us all to consider and work together to overcome. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Mr. Hanson, thank you for those comments there. Very enlightening. If nobody pulls a thread on some of those topics you pulled up, I definitely have one or two comments or questions for you on that one. And Ms. Heinrichs?
Sure. Great. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Heather, for this great project. as I was reading through the essays that were submitted, I was having a lot of flashbacks from our conversations, debates through the Strategic Posture Commission, because we did consider a lot of the arguments that were put forward in the essays that were submitted. And so I think that's a good starting place, and I hope to tie in some of the remarks from the two other panelists here. How was it that the 12 of us commissioners were able to come to consensus when we did wrestle with all of the various ideas that were put forward in the essays through Project Adam? And I would say, as Madeline already described, but then I want to dig in a little bit more, it was very, very threat-based. Very threat-based. And so when we look at what the commission was mandated to do by Congress, it's big. It's a big problem to tackle. So where do you begin? And so we really began with what are our adversaries doing? And we looked at capabilities, and then we also did our best to grapple with, and what is it that they're investing in these capabilities for, and how are they using them? And so really trying to understand the nature of the threat so that we can understand then how we need to respond to that. And I just want to quote a little bit, just to give you a taste too, from the recent China military report. Between the fall of 2021 and the fall of 2023, the United States has documented over 180 instances of PLA coercive and risky air intercepts against U.S. aircraft in the region, more in the past 2 years than in the previous decade. And then the number against coercive and risky operational behavior against U.S. and allied aircraft have included lasing, reckless maneuvers, close approaches in the air or sea, high rates of closure. It goes on and on. But why do I bring that up in the context of a strategic posture? Well, because these are all, in the conventional space, demonstrations of coercive behavior on the part of the PLA while they are engaged in this expansive and dedicated effort to expand their nuclear program as well. That these are going hand in glove, and this is the kind of behavior that we're seeing on the part of our adversaries. And we use the word adversary in the commission report as opposed to competitor. And why is that? Well, because it will affect how we make findings and recommendations about how the United States should respond. And so I think that that's an important thing to sort of get in place, because if a failure, one of the failures or one of the obstacles to building a flexible force is really a failure to get on the same page about the nature of the threat. And so that would be point one. So we look at the China obviously is no longer the lesser included case with Russia. So as Madeline already said, in 2009, the last time there was a commission report, really, if you look at the language, and I would really encourage you, it's a really interesting exercise to compare our report with the 2009 report, because you can see the different assumptions about the threat environment that then shaped how the commissioners then thought about how we need to respond. The other thing that I think is really important is a failure to, an obstacle to building a flexible force is failing to understand the stakes. So we as a commission spent a lot of time on the stakes section, getting all 12 of us to understand what is the U.S. strategic posture even supposed to do. And so getting out of this mindset that we're not just bean counting, how many nuclear weapons do they have, how many nuclear weapons do we need then? It's not what we did. What is the adversary trying to do, and what are we trying to protect? And that gets us, I think, in the right mindset to think about then what a strategy or a policy might be for the U.S. strategic posture. And the stakes are high. We are moving into a very perilous age in which we have two determined adversaries, sometimes collaborating in extremely concerning ways in the military domain to undermine U.S. credibility, undermine U.S. and allied security in a variety of ways across multiple theaters. So that, I think, is really important. So number two obstacle for building a flexible force is failing to understand how the United States thinks about deterrence. Frank gave a really great explanation that the Commission grappled with what is deterrence, how have we thought about it since the Cold War, and do we need to change the way we think about deterrence? And we concluded that we do not. that deterrence is still sound, that has not changed. I like to say we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but the wheel needs more spokes. And so that's kind of where we are. We're looking at how, if we have these two peer adversaries determined to supplant the United States and the U.S. led rules-based order, then how must the United States think about deterring both of those powers potentially simultaneously, and whether it's using a moment of opportunity or if they're collaborating in some sense. And so, we thought long and hard about how we're going to do this, and we concluded that yes, that the deterrence and the tenets for deterrence remain sound. What do the adversaries value, and then how can we be sure that we can be able to credibly communicate to our adversary in a way that they believe that the United States has the will and the ability to put a weapon on that target. And so we believe that that does not need to be changed in terms of how we think about doing that. And then the other piece of that is that, again, affirming the bipartisan agreement across multiple administrations since the Cold War, and really clarified by the Obama unclassified employment doctrine, and then the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration, NPR, that if deterrence does, heaven forbid, fail, that the United States would seek to end that conflict and reestablish deterrence on the lowest levels of violence. And that was something that the Commission understood was very important. And to Madeline's point, the Commission absolutely rejects the notion or the characterization that the United States, or that the Commission was putting forward this idea of nuclear warfighting. It's certainly not the case. We are, however, affirming the way the United States thinks about deterrence, that we would, in fact, seek to reestablish deterrence if deterrence fails. And we want to be able to communicate to our adversary that any path that they might think that they can take, that they will not prevail. And we want to be able to convince them that we have the means to be able to convince them that they should pursue an end to the conflict by demonstrating both restraint and resolve on our part. It's really important to understand that. So I think we're going to have these conversations over and over again, much like our country did, in fact, during the Cold War, when we were trying to think about how best to implement credible deterrence and wage deterrence. That's the other thing I've been trying to sort of change the mindset, is deterrence is not passive. We are waging deterrence. And so how do we think about doing that in an effective way? And then the third thing, potential obstacle is failing to understand this. It really does have, when we say whole of government, I really don't like that phrase, but I'm using it right now, and it's in our report. But what we mean is, we really do mean that the country has to understand across departments that this is going to require people to understand this is the national priority. It is not a national priority. And it's not just a national priority for the Department of Defense. It's a priority for the Secretary of Energy, and we include that in the report as well. We also bring in the Treasury Department, so that Treasury can think about, are there things that we can do and we can be smart about as a country to buy ourselves some time in the economic domain? And so that also is something I think that we can bring to bear and use those tools also to help ourselves. And then the last point I would make is just this is fourth obstacle is really having a lack of foresight about what we can do to set ourselves up the next 3 to 5 years. Madeline already made this point. I think Frank made it too, and I think Greg did too, which is that our recommendations are really in the business of opening doors for ourselves and for future decision makers if we were to decide to pursue 300 B-21s instead of 100. Or if we do need to pursue the SLCMN, that we want to make sure that we are making decisions now that do not close those doors if we decide that we need to pursue them in the next 3 to 5 years. And that requires a lot of thinking now to set ourselves up. And we really put that back on the department to do some of these studies and analysis to see what might be required to be able to do that. But that's something that we embrace, and I think that failing to do that can really cause trouble for us as we pursue a flexible deterrent that can meet the challenges today. I didn't have this on here, but I was thinking as I was talking, it kind of made me think that the last one is, I think, an obstacle would be sort of paralysis of indecision, because we make, I think, 81 recommendations, which is half the number of recommendations made by the last commission. So we're in good shape. The next one can make half, I guess, than that. But But we really did try to make it a usable document to get people to sort of take a bite of the apple and run with it. And so I think that some of our recommendations, people focus a lot on the bigger ticket items, even if they are sort of future years spending. But there's other things that we can do, like Pillar 2 and AUKUS. We embraced AUKUS. Are there things reforms that we can make for technology sharing across our allies that would get us in a better position in terms of timing and the imperative of actually moving fast on this? And then just puts on what Frank said, tankers. I mean, that's something that we're going to have to do regardless. And so that's sort of one of the less challenged, I think, politically items that we can do. We can pursue that. And then the other thing is leveraging commercial. One of the reasons that I think that we got some of our optimism, or we do think that so many of these big things are doable, is because we had briefings where we looked to see what commercial was doing and what are these emerging technologies. And if they can do it in the commercial space, of course, I think we can do this as a national imperative if it means deterring major power conflict. And so I think failing to see that would be a challenge for the United States to be able to execute some of these things.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Heinrichs, for the passionate comments there. With that in mind, the paralysis of indecision, one of the questions from the audience members here is, and this is up to any of one, Ms. Crean, this kind of goes to you for, you mentioned before, what is the status of the Conventional Nuclear Integration, CNI, and what issues are impeding its implementation?
I don't know. I'll defer that to somebody else.
I think, does it read conventional nuclear integration? The commission, I think, is the wrong C there.
I mean, I don't know of a commission on that, so.
Okay.
Sorry. I mean, is it what are the commission views of?
Yeah, I don't. Whoever somebody wrote that question in here, they get
it's probably conventional nuclear integration.
That's my guess.
Yeah, conventional.
Conventional.
Oh, conventional, not a commission.
No,
yeah.
Sorry,
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, we certainly talked about that. We found, notwithstanding all the years of discussion and hand-wringing, that it still has a very long way to go. But we also wanted to make clear that when we talk about conventional nuclear integration, we are not talking about nuclear warfighting. What we're really talking about is a continuum of deterrence that starts with conventional deterrence, because at the outset, you don't ever want to be in that war. And so you stay out of that war by having strong conventional deterrence, which is the beginning of all of the deterrence, and want to make sure that, like the comment was said, STRATCOM isn't the break glass, so that everybody understands, well, what is the next step? I'm not a believer in the escalation ladder, but nevertheless, as one goes down this road, what is it that makes sure that everybody understands how that deterrent works? What are those things that, God forbid, if there is nuclear use, that you're going to have to respond? Tankers live in both worlds, right? These are the sorts of things that we really have to focus on. Command and control. Again, not mixing nuclear command and control. I've heard several criticisms that the report has recommended a combination of nuclear command and control, conventional command and control. We don't talk about that. We talk about modernization of both. We talk about making sure the president has time to make decisions. But we have to be better in terms of how we think about this continuing deterrence. Sorry. I thought you had said a commission.
I'm sorry.
I've never heard of a commission on conventional.
Sorry.
We'll be asked to chair that, too.
Yeah, no, not happening.
You two have anything to add on that?
Rebecca?
No, I mean, I don't have anything else to add to Madeline. I would just also just say, I mean, this is really, did we full on embrace integrated deterrence as the phrase and concept? I forget. I have to reread it again. No, I mean, I think what I agree with everything Madeline said. And I think what we were looking at is, how can we bring in conventional forces also to help us to stay away from the nuclear precipice? So that's why we get back to the two-war construct and to build out conventional forces. Because if this country, over the last couple of decades, one of our goals has been to move away from nuclear deterrence in our defense strategy as we seek to implement our defense strategy. If we're going to do that, you're going to have to bolster conventional weapons. And so we really tried to look at, okay, well then we're going to, I mean, we're the Strategic Posture Commission, but we're still going to make this very full-throated argument that you have to increase conventional if you don't want to rely more on nuclear. And then you also have to have nuclear to backstop what we're doing conventionally. But, and then we also make recommendations in the conventional space, long-range strike, and then also talk about tankers, live in both spaces, and then also in missile defense. We've already hit home on I mean, it's a big deal, I think, that the Commission came to the conclusion, again, threat-based, where we are very concerned about the coercive threat from Russia and China against the U.S. homeland, specifically because we're worried that just as we are more familiar with this concept that Russia and China would want to convince the United States, as we've seen Russia try to do with Ukraine, try to convince the United States not to back our allies in a regional conflict. And so they might do something or either escalate horizontally or vertically to frighten the United States into not sending additional defenses and help to our allies. Well, they might do that against the U.S. homeland as well in order to frighten the United States rather than enrage the United States, I think or something like that is the way to characterize it. So that there is a role for missile defense as well, even in the U.S. strategic posture, and it's to take away the temptation of that coercive threat.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is the quote I had from the NPR, and Madeline noted page numbers for the Posture Commission report. So my inset quote was from page 10 of the NPR, if anyone wants to check. The NPR talks about deterrence options, backstopped by a credible nuclear deterrent. Backstop doesn't mean it's not there. As I said in my remarks, doesn't necessarily mean it's recessed. I think it is present, and we have to think about how it is present in a way that then allows nuclear and conventional forces doing complementary things to address the fact, and I think this is sometimes missed, and I'm not sure if this is the questioner's intent. Sometimes conventional nuclear integration critics try to say, well, this is lowering thresholds or things like that. Amongst other reasons I would disagree is that one of the reasons we talk about conventional nuclear integration is that integration has already happened for our adversaries. They have integrated their conventional and unconventional forces, not even just nuclear, and in a way that we have to address and have to think about, not even just in terms of deterrence for the United States. This also comes from assurance requests from our allies. They want to know the U.S. nuclear deterrent is there, will protect them, and is present in a way in regional crises and potentially conflicts where it is integrated along with a strong conventional deterrent from U.S. and allied forces. So that's something that it is the challenge presented to us that we are responding to, and we are working on it, and that's one of the reasons you see it highlighted within the last nuclear posture review.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Kind of pulling the thread on this one here we talked about production and infrastructure here. So this question goes that given the labs are currently moving as fast as they can with a program of record and nuclear infrastructure investments would take a long time to implement. What are some other ways NSA can create better flexibility in the nuclear force?
So there are, well, first, obviously there's a ton of work because particularly on the production side of the infrastructure, there wasn't much done over the last several years. Rightly, frankly, the focus and attention had been on the science infrastructure. So the science tools that are now available to the NNSA and to the labs are what have enabled us to maintain the stockpile, maintain our deterrent, safe, secure, reliable, and effective without explosive nuclear testing. And that's absolutely essential. And so now we have to go back and keep going on the rest of that infrastructure. And yes, it will be hard. It's going to take a long time. One of the lessons learned, and we discussed this, is once you lose the ability to do something, it's very hard to get it back. And that's where the NNSA is right now. It's trying to figure out how to redo, remake, reestablish all these things that got lost over the last 20 years. It's very hard. But to your question, in terms of how do you be more forward-looking and flexible, so NNSA kind of had to go back and recreate this stuff to be able to maintain the stockpile. But having now gone through one round of life extensions, now it's time to be a little more creative. So how do you use new technologies? How can you go a little bit faster? How can it cost a little bit less money? Are there ways to do it that don't exactly replicate every step at Rocky Flats? Let's have the labs be a little more thoughtful. How can even the designs be somewhat simpler? There's some nascent efforts in the labs to think about this. There's some nascent efforts at NNSA to think about this. But these are ways where you can be a little more flexible, and maybe things can get done a little bit faster without ever leaving behind the testing pedigree.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing I'll highlight, and the Center for the Study of WMD, and Madeline was one of the participants. This summer we worked with NNSA, and NNSA hosted an event looking at science and technology innovation and what that meant for integrated deterrence. And I think I would just briefly summarize that we're fortunate that NNSA, DOE, the labs are a locus of scientific achievement and innovation that's unique and incredibly valuable for us in the United States. And I think that there are ways in which DoD and others can work together with NNSA and the labs to say, look, you have the expertise, you have the ingenuity, you have the capacity to think creatively to help us solve, deterrence problem X. It might be a nuclear-related problem. It might be, something else. And I think that more of that will happen into the future. More of those discussions will happen, and more of those asks will happen. And all of this is, I hope, a reflection over time of how to do integrated deterrence better. And whole of government makes Rebecca wince, and I understand why. But we have a lot of capacity and capability across the government that doesn't always, it'll shock everyone, speak to each other and really work together, always on the same page. That's something that we have to do better in the future. And part of it is because these challenges are complex in a way in which I need the best scientists, the best strategists, the best financiers to work the problem together to deter our adversaries.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. One of the other questions that came in here talks about the Strategic Posture Commission. It says it assumes that Russia and China will continue on their current paths. Is there anything that we can do now to get them off these paths?
Implement
Rebecca?
the strategic posture. I mean, the idea, I would love for the country to take the commission report and just begin doing it, and then the Chinese and the Russians decide that they should stop pursuing the path they're on. That would be great. But that's the idea. The idea here, and this really gets at the panel, not the last panel, but the one before that, about whether or not this is an arms race. We are really the ones that have been flat-footed. Based on the last strategic posture review, 2009, fundamentally had different assumptions. It was very optimistic about arms control with our adversaries. It was optimistic about major power conflict being a thing of the past, not high risk, and really focused on nuclear terrorism. Very serious problem, but not what we're dealing with today. And so we believe that the whole purpose of the report is really to get our adversaries to change their calculations about what's going to work for them. And so that's why we left it open for there being a possibility for risk reduction and arms control. We were not, just convinced that there was no hope that the adversary might change. We just don't see any evidence of that. And we hope that if we begin pursuing these recommendations, our adversaries will decide that they're not going to prevail on the path that they're on.
Okay. Thank you.
So I would add, I think we need to have a bit of a change in mindset in terms of how we have discussions with China and Russia, because we need to have discussions at all levels, military to military, State Department to MFA, MOD to DOD, at all levels. And we have to figure out a way to get these discussions back and to make them be acceptable and change what I think is very often an attitude that says, well, discussions, we can't do discussions because it would just be rewarding bad behavior. That's not the right approach. Even during the Cold War, I mean, we had lots of discussions. And I get that a lot of these discussions end up just being that, nothing comes out of them. But there's even value to that. I mean, there's value to the relationship building, there's value to the understanding, there's value to the learning. We learn when we talk, you know, they learn when we talk. So if these things can happen again, I think that is one of the way to begin to open some of these doors and to build some of these relationships on a person-to-person level even, while we implement all the rest of our recommendations.
And you said one of the perceptions of talking to them is kind of like what's kind of been hindering the conversations. Is there anything else that's been hindering the conversation between the?
Well, I mean, part of it is up until yesterday, there's been reluctance certainly on China's part to have these conversations. But at that, so I have no idea what happened yesterday. But the fact that it happened is good, and finding other ways to have discussions, finding ways to have discussions on risk reduction, on shared proliferation concerns, whatever it is. We just need to be very creative in terms of how we think about going forward and having these. And it doesn't have to be bilateral. They can be multilateral. You know, we just have to figure out how to get conversations going again.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Anderson, Ms. Heinrichs, have anything to add on that?
No, just to say that the Chinese have been unwilling to talk. I mean, that's been the big obstacle, and the Russians have not been willing to abide by their arms control obligations, and so it's our adversaries that have chosen this particular situation that we're in, and so I think what Madeline said is right. Be willing to have these conversations, but at the same time, be clear-eyed about the grim likelihood of progress in the near term.
Appreciate that. And I think we have time for one more question here, so I'll ask this one here. Does Sentinel fit in the need for a more flexible force? What would you change about it, and are these changes feasible?
Well, I think you have to have three legs of a deterrent to have a flexible force, just as sort of an operating assumption. Each leg of the deterrent brings something that's important and vital to having a deterrent that, you know, isn't just the U.S., you know, nuclear deterrence for the sake of the United States, but through extended deterrence, a deterrent we extend to other countries. And each leg is important. You know, the feature often highlighted with the ICBM, the Sentinel will have many good features, is its promptness, that no adversary can believe that they could launch an attack upon the United States without facing potential of a prompt and devastating response, as delivered, at least in part, by the Sentinel ICBM. I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is referring to in terms of things, you know, different. I guess I would just observe, and this is, you know, something that everyone working on the Sentinel is aware of, is it's a fundamentally different operating and risk environment than it was for the Minuteman III. That's because of, you know, things adversaries are doing, and that's certainly something that's been cognizant, you know, of the delivery system, and then you know, the warheads that will be put atop it. So I'm not sure if they're looking for a specific, some specific characteristic that they think is important, but I would just observe, I think it is important to remember that inasmuch as modernization is going to give us a strategic nuclear triad, that is the submarines and the ICBMs and the bombers, and so same in that way. You know, we are asking the different legs to, you know, do more in an operating environment that is different than it's been for the strategic triad. And this is one of the points, you know, I wanted to highlight in my presentation. You know, we have to assume this is the deterrent for the next generation or longer, and that means that puts weight on each of these systems and the developers and then the testing of the systems, because they have to be the best today and for a very long time. You know, and we'll work very hard to do that, you know, everyone who works on those projects. But that is something to remember, and I think relevant then to the Strategic Posture Commission report, that this can't be a process of, you know, we get modernization and then, you know, job done. We've got a deterrent that's going to last, you know, indefinitely over time. Things are going to change. Adversaries are going to continue to build systems. We're going to have to ask a lot of our U.S. nuclear deterrent force, whatever it looks like, on into the future and on into our children's future. And so that is, I think, a challenge everyone is appraised and aware of. And that is something that means today's Sentinel has to do everything the Minuteman III did and also be a little bit better.
Yes. Ms. Heinrich, do you have something to add to that?
Not in Sentinel. Okay. I just have my parting shots.
Okay, and I'll get to that here. Okay. So we're wrapping up the questions there, and I'm going to give the opportunity 2 minutes each. They can just kind of give me some wrapping, some saved rounds, as I would call it, of last-minute comments. So, Ms. Crean, we'll start with you.
Well, first, I just want to commend PONI for the timing of this, whether it was intentional or not. I think having multiple reports on this topic is a good thing right now. This, as I said at the outset, we need to talk about this more. So the more reports, the more discussions, the more fora, and the more we can get it out of the Beltway is even more important, because these are conversations that really do need to happen more broadly. And however that can happen, whatever creativity we can generate to have these discussions is very important. And I think the final shot really is. We do have a changed environment, and we have to come to grips with this. And as much as we don't like this changed environment, it is what it is, and it's one of the reasons that the Commission certainly reached consensus. And I will note, when in your report, how you have the various writers, and so there are various themes that they take on the various topics. They are remarkably close. You do not have massive differences for the most part, and I would say it's probably all driven by the threat, and we just have to understand it, and then figure out how to change it. How to make this a little bit better. I'm in some other dialogues, and somebody made the comment that, it's the Posture Commission report has dark futures, and it's like, well, it sort of does, because unfortunately that's the threat. And I think the challenge is, how do you not let us go into the dark futures? What are those things that we can do to avoid that?
Agree. Mr. Anderson?
I think I would just note, I think it was well said by Madeline and Rebecca, the comparisons of the two posture commissions, and I remember reading through the 2008 report. That was a much more optimistic time with regard to looking at nuclear threats. 2008 was a minute ago, but it wasn't that long ago. And I think it's important to emphasize and recognize that other states had choices to make, and they placed their resources and bets on building larger, more diverse, more capable nuclear forces, and thinking very hard about how that fit into not just the way they thought about nuclear deterrence, but the way they thought about power projection, and about ways to exert influence, about ways to coerce other states. Those were choices that they made, and those are choices that we must respond to for the defense, not just of the United States, but also our allies. And so I think it's important to understand how the environment has changed, that in a lot of ways that change has happened quite rapidly, but it's changed because of things that those other states have decided to do. And now it is incumbent upon us to respond. And I give credit to the Strategic Posture Commission and to CSIS and Forth's report that these are all important efforts to inform our decision makers in facing some difficult choices. It is a difficult strategic environment today and on into the future. But I think that just highlights how important our nuclear deterrent is today and tomorrow.
Thank you. Silence.
I would just want to emphasize that, I think that there can be, and I'm already beginning to see it with some of these think tank pieces that are coming out, there is a temptation to see how bleak the future kind of looks when it comes to the nature of the threat, and that the future of arms control doesn't look all that promising. And so there will be a temptation to try to change the way the United States thinks about deterrence, or change the way the United States thinks about strategy for deterrence, so that we don't have to do some of these hard things that we might have to do in the near future. And I think that's part of what was going on with the conversation that Frank was talking about, how the United States, you know, we know how to do deterrence, at least we think we do to the best of our ability. It's a kind of hard thing to prove, except we're the absence of major power war. But again, we embrace those deterrence tenets, and that means that we hold at risk what the adversary values. And we want to do that now for both Russia and China. And they are, and Frank, you can correct me if I get the words all wrong, but it's, you know, it's the regime, it's the conventional and strategic weapons, it's the war-supporting industry, and it's their means of holding political control. We know that those are the categories that the strategic posture still puts forward as something that is prudent to do, and understanding also that there may be a temptation to replace how we do deterrence with other means beyond nuclear, but just to remind ourselves that nuclear weapons still has a deterrent value that goes beyond merely just the purely sort of military effect of a nuclear employment. And so the whole object of what we're trying to do is to deter major power conflict. And so just to sort of try to resist the temptation to look for shortcuts that might increase the risk of deterrence failure. And so really wanted to just foot stop that point, and that we do it in a way that complies with the laws of armed conflict. And that's something also that we believed it was important to include in the strategic posture review. So thank you all. Thank you, Heather, for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you all for your time. I know the contributions you make to the nuclear enterprises make positive effects, so we do really appreciate that. So we'll give a hand of applause, and we'll invite Ms. Williams up here.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of a pretty busy and thought-provoking day. I have a couple parting shots as well. Just very quickly, I did want to kind of point out a few folks I talked to during the lunch break said it's a really impressive diversity of views that you got, and that it's a bit refreshing on this topic. And I thought we did have actually a really great diversity of views today, but also in the Project Adam report. And when we went into the Project Adam report, I'll be honest, I went into it with a little bit of trepidation, putting certain people in the room, and I'm not naming it in the same room, not naming any names. I was shocked by how much agreement there was. And I was pretty surprised by a few points of agreement today that I really do want to highlight, because I think they're really fundamental in how we move forward in thinking about deterring two-peer competitors and this concept of flexibility. So 4 specific points where I heard, I don't want to say consensus, but a large amount of agreement. And the first one really shone through in this last panel, and that is about the nature of the threat. The adversaries are showing us who they are. We should probably be listening to them. Rebecca had a fantastic comment that I really want to foot stomp. The failure to build a flexible force would be a failure to, oh God, I can't read this now, would be a failure to get on the same page about the threat. Failure to build a flexible force would be a failure to get on the same page about the threat, and also about the need for shared understanding of the stakes. And I think that today I'm finding we do seem to have a pretty good shared understanding about the nature of the threat and what is at stake. Second area of quite some agreement, some of the biggest challenges that we face are our own. They are internal. They are issues with funding, defense acquisition, the nuclear enterprise, and so we have some work to do on our own end in particular. Third point, the status quo is not going to cut it. I do not want to speak for all the panelists about the program of record, but what I am hearing is that the program of record alone may not be sufficient for facing the threat that we are coming up against. And that might mean not just nuclear program of record, but also additional conventional capabilities, emerging technologies. NC2 came up a lot. I think Leonore made a really fantastic point during the Q&A of the first panel about the need. We can't just keep treating nuclear issues in a silo. Pun intended on that one, so thank you for the chuckles. And then final point is something that Frank talked about, Elaine, and quite a few others. We need a little bit of a degree of humility in going into this topic, because we don't know the future. I mean, anyone here who claims they know what Vladimir Putin is thinking and what he's going to do next, well, I challenge you on that assumption. And so with that era of uncertainty that we're living in, to me, that is perhaps one of the strongest cases for flexibility, that we don't know what we are facing totally. We don't fully understand where we are headed. And so having more options on the table is not only good for deterrence, also good for assuring allies. So that's kind of my big takeaways from today, but really wanted to put those out there. In terms of next steps, if you haven't already, please read the Project Adam report and the Strategic Posture Commission, and don't misquote it. That was another takeaway from today. Do not misrepresent it. With Project Adam, we are hoping to do this again, to do the Project Adam approach again next year. We are thinking about various topics and bigger overarching strategic questions that we might engage with. If after today something big is jumping to mind for you, let Lachlan or I know. We're really open to hearing what you all think are some of the big questions. Another thing for the way ahead, if you are not already, please get involved in PONI. We have some really exciting things going on. This year is PONI's 20th anniversary, which is extremely exciting. And so we're having an anniversary conference here at CSIS December 5th. Yes, December 5th. And this conference will be a little bit different than our usual conferences because we're going to bring back some PONI alumni who have gone on to do phenomenal things. And we'll also be bringing back the original PONI director, Clark Murdoch, which I'm very excited. It'd be great to have Clark here. And then other thing, just in terms of next steps, I know some of you are sticking around for some follow-on discussions. Just loiter out in the hallway and we'll find you and tell you where to go. So with that, last thing for me to do, perhaps most important, is some thank yous. First and foremost, I really do want to thank the audience for the phenomenal questions that came through. Sitting up here moderating, sometimes it's like, oh God, what questions am I going to get? And when I was moderating, like, some really fantastic questions. So thank you all so much for getting involved and asking such great questions. I really want to thank the Project Adam authors, 4 of whom are here. I think 4 of whom are here, and two who couldn't join. You put in so much time into this project, and I think it really showed and came through. I hope it was worthwhile for you. Madeline, I wish I could take credit for the timing of this. I did not know when the Strategic Posture Commission would be released. Had I known, I would have told you, I assure you. But I really want to thank some of the people involved in Project Adam who were also working on the Strategic Posture Commission at the same time. I'm guessing it was a very spicy and busy season for you, but really appreciate your time on that. I want to thank all of our speakers, all of our moderators. Really big thank you to our sponsor for today's event, Northrop Grumman Corporation. And then lastly, to really thank the CSIS team, the AV folks who were fantastic as always. And perhaps most important person of all is Lachlan McKenzie, who got you all here and has been in communications with you all and was also really essential for getting Project Adam over the finish line and working with all of our authors. So with that brings our proceedings to an end, but thank you all again so much for coming and hope to see you at PONI again soon.